Miss Marple and the Phantom Beyond the Pane, Chapter 1. A knock at the cottage. The early morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's quaint cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting golden patterns across the polished floor. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and the ever-present aroma of chamomile tea, which Miss Marple often sipped as she sorted through village correspondence or pieced together her latest knitting project. Today, however, she had set aside her knitting needles and was meticulously reviewing the local parish newsletter, correcting a rather glaring error in the gardening club's meeting date. Outside, birds chirped in a steady, peaceful rhythm. It was a morning like many others in the village, quiet, uneventful, steeped in routine. Miss Marple, now well into her 80s, found great comfort in that predictability. But fate, as it often does in the life of the observant elderly lady, had other plans. There came a knock at the door, 3 soft raps, spaced closely together. The sound was enough to startle Miss Marple slightly, but she didn't get up. Instead, she called out gently, "Edith, dear, could you see who that is?" The maid, a tall, no-nonsense girl with tied-back hair and practical shoes, quickly appeared from the adjoining kitchen. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, crisply, and went to answer the door. Miss Marple returned to her notes, but listened carefully as the door opened. The voice that drifted in was young, polished, a little hesitant. "Good morning. I'm Ethel. I believe Miss Marple knows my mother. I'm her daughter." Miss Marple's ears perked up. She stood slowly, placing her papers aside. Her interest immediately piqued. By the time Edith led the young woman into the sitting room, Miss Marple was already rising from her armchair. "Oh, my goodness," she said, peering at the visitor through her delicate wire-frame spectacles. "Is it really you, Ethel? Well, heavens, you were just a little thing last time I saw you. Must be 15 years ago at least." Ethel smiled warmly. She was in her late 20s, elegantly dressed but without pretense, her features refined, and her hair pulled back in a neat bun. There was a touch of nervous energy in her manner, but she tried her best to maintain composure. "It's so lovely to see you again, Auntie Marple," Ethel said, using the honorary title with genuine affection. Miss Marple stepped forward and took both of her hands. "You've grown into a beautiful young lady. I always said you'd take after your mother, and here you are, the very image of her at your age." She turned to Edith. "Be a dear, and bring some tea for our guest, will you? Perhaps those lemon biscuits as well." "Yes, ma'am," the maid replied and disappeared into the kitchen. Miss Marple gestured for Ethel to sit down on the sofa, and she herself resumed her place in the armchair opposite. Her keen blue eyes watched the young woman thoughtfully. "I hope your mother is well?" she asked, settling her skirt neatly. "She is, thank you. Still in Surrey, still painting in her garden whenever the weather allows." Miss Marple chuckled. "That sounds like her. I remember she once said she couldn't think clearly unless her hands smelled of soil and turpentine." Both women shared a soft laugh. "I must admit I wasn't expecting visitors this morning," Miss Marple said with a hint of curiosity in her voice, "but you're most welcome. Do tell me, what brings you here, my dear?" Before Ethel could answer, Edith returned with the tea tray, setting it down between them with the efficiency only long service could teach. Steam wafted gently from the porcelain cups, and the scent of lemon wafted from the fresh biscuits. They sipped quietly for a moment. Then, as the silence grew longer, Ethel placed her teacup down with deliberate care and looked directly at Miss Marple. "Auntie Marple, I came because I need your help." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but the glint in her eyes sharpened. "My help?" she asked gently. "What kind of help?" There was a pause, measured, cautious, before Ethel began to speak. "I was engaged. His name was Lucas. We met a little over a year ago. He was charming, successful, and for a while, I believed he truly loved me." Her voice tightened slightly. "But it wasn't long before he changed, cold, distant. And then, one day, without warning, he broke off the engagement." Miss Marple tilted her head sympathetically but said nothing. "He married someone else," Ethel continued, her tone still composed, but underlined with hurt. "A much younger girl named Abigail. The whole thing happened within weeks. It was humiliating. No explanation, no closure. I was simply replaced." Miss Marple gave a small nod of understanding. "And now?" Ethel looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Now Lucas has reached out again. He's bought a new house and is throwing a grand party this Saturday. He's invited me." "And you're considering going?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Ethel gave a short, ironic laugh. "I know it's foolish. I know why he's doing it. He wants to parade his new life in front of me. Show off his house, his young wife, his success. He wants me to come, to see it all, and feel small." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Then why go?" "Because I want to look him in the eye. I want to see what kind of man he's really become. Maybe I want him to see that I'm not broken by what he did." There was a flicker of something deeper in Ethel's eyes, pride, yes, but also pain. After a pause, she added, "But I don't want to go alone. I was hoping. Would you come with me?" Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She sipped her tea again, gaze steady. Then, with the smallest smile, she said, "Yes, I will go with you." Ethel visibly relaxed. "Thank you, the party is in 2 days, Saturday evening." "Then we have time to prepare," Miss Marple replied. "And if Lucas has hidden motives, I dare say we might uncover them too." The young woman stood to leave, gratitude in her eyes. "I'll come pick you up. Around 4. "That would be fine," Miss Marple said. "Until then, my dear." With a final hug and a soft smile, Ethel left the cottage. As the door closed behind her, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression thoughtful. It was not just a social call or a plea from a wounded heart. It was something more. There was a tension in Ethel's words, something unsaid, something buried beneath the surface. Miss Marple reached for her notebook. "Let's see," she murmured to herself. "Lucas, Abigail, betrayal, and an invitation. That sort of party often leads to more than polite conversation." Outside, the quiet village carried on as usual, but inside the little cottage, the game had begun. Chapter 2. The House with the Haunted Window. Saturday arrived cloaked in overcast skies and a whisper of wind in the air. The sort of day that seemed ordinary enough on the surface. But Miss Marple, ever sensitive to the subtle dissonances of life, had woken with a peculiar feeling she couldn't quite name. By mid-morning, she had donned her best blue-grey tweed coat, pinned a small brooch to her collar, and packed a modest handbag with only the essentials, a handkerchief, a notebook, and her ever-trusty silver pen. Her demeanor was calm, composed as always, but she couldn't deny a faint prickle of curiosity, tinged with apprehension, at what the evening might reveal. At precisely noon, she stood waiting at the small village train station, glancing every so often at the empty road. Ethel arrived not long after, her green car rumbling to a stop with a slight jerk. "I'm sorry if I kept you waiting," Ethel said as Miss Marple settled into the passenger seat. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, fastening her seatbelt. "I always find a quiet wait gives one time to think." The hour-long drive passed mostly in silence, the countryside rolling by in shades of early spring green and stone-fenced fields. When they finally arrived, Ethel slowed and turned onto a gravel path that led to an imposing 2-story house, perched slightly uphill and shadowed by tall oaks. Several cars were already parked along the driveway. As Ethel parked and cut the engine, Miss Marple peered up at the house. It was large, well kept, with ivy beginning to curl around the corners. Yet, despite its grandeur, there was something about it, perhaps the way the front windows seemed too dark, too still, that gave her a moment's pause. Inside, the house was alive with the quiet murmur of conversation and the faint clinking of glasses. The hallway was richly decorated, but not tastefully so. There were bold tapestries, a glaring chandelier, and furniture that looked expensive, but lacked warmth. A few guests stood scattered about the drawing room, drinks in hand, but the party had not yet swelled to any notable number. Lucas stood near the fireplace, his arm lightly resting around the waist of a striking young woman. She wore a pale blue silk dress that clung to her delicate frame and highlighted the effortless poise in her manner. She was easily 10 years younger than Ethel, and worlds apart in demeanor. As soon as Lucas spotted them, he approached. "Well, well," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Ethel didn't respond. She merely looked past Lucas at his wife, her eyes lingering in quiet observation. Miss Marple, standing beside her, noted the tension that flickered briefly in Lucas's jaw. Surprise, perhaps, or something darker beneath it. "This is Abigail," Lucas said, gesturing to the young woman. "My wife." Abigail gave Ethel a small, polite smile, gracious but distant. Miss Marple offered a kindly nod. "Pleased to meet you, my dear. What a lovely home you have." Abigail thanked her, though there was a slight unease in her voice. Miss Marple filed it away in the quiet corners of her mind. Before long, the call for dinner was made, and the small group of guests moved into the adjoining dining room. The table was long, set meticulously, though the seating arrangement felt a little too calculated. Lucas played host charmingly, ensuring wine was poured and courses were served in perfect order. But amid the polished performance, Miss Marple noted how Lucas's eyes darted more than they should, toward Ethel, toward his wife, toward the man across the table. That man, a thick-set, middle-aged fellow with a thinning mustache, had been sitting beside Lucas and whispering to him throughout the soup course. At the main course, the two briefly excused themselves and stepped outside through the French doors leading to the garden. "They've been gone a while," Miss Marple murmured to Ethel, who hadn't touched her food. Ethel, staring into her wine glass, muttered, "Probably discussing business. Or lies." The two returned shortly afterward, and dessert was served. As plates were cleared and coffee poured, Lucas rose to speak. "Thank you all for coming," he said, raising his glass. "As you know, we've just moved into this house, and tonight is a celebration of new beginnings." There was a light smattering of polite applause. "I'd like to introduce you all properly," Lucas continued. "First, this gentleman, George. He's a detective, though more the private kind than police." George gave a faint smirk and lifted his drink. Miss Marple observed him closely. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie uneven, and though his demeanor aimed at charm, there was a weariness behind his eyes. She leaned ever so slightly toward Ethel and whispered, "He looks like someone who's read more detective novels than solved real cases." Lucas continued, introducing Abigail again. Then Leo, a gray-haired, sturdy man with a strong handshake and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. Leo was with the police force for 30 years, Lucas explained. "Retired now, but still sharper than most." Lastly, Lucas gestured to a young man with messy hair and a camera hanging around his neck. "This is John. When Abigail and I visited Germany last autumn, he became a good friend to us both." There was something odd in the way Lucas said it, too casual, as though preemptively quelling suspicion. Miss Marple made a mental note. Lucas had barely sat back down when George cleared his throat loudly and stood. His voice had a slurred edge now, his drink sloshing slightly in his hand. "You all think this is just a party," he began with a grin that didn't quite settle. "But Lucas forgot to mention the ghost story that came with the house." Miss Marple turned her gaze to George, her interest piqued. George continued, "This house has history. About 40 years ago, a man and his wife lived here. The wife had an affair, wanted to run off with another man, so she poisoned her husband. A hush fell over the room. George's voice was rising. But before she fled, she looked back at the window, the one overlooking the garden, and there he was, her husband, dead, standing, wearing his hat, just staring." A nervous laugh escaped from someone, but it was quickly swallowed by silence. "Scared her to death," George added, eyes gleaming. "Dropped right there in the garden. Heart attack. They say her ghost roams too, and the room, anyone who goes into that window room, dies." There was a pause. Miss Marple observed the room. Leo had stiffened, John looked embarrassed, and Abigail was pale. Suddenly Abigail rose and excused herself. A few seconds later, John followed. Ethel, without a word, stood and went after them. George slumped back into his chair, then abruptly stood again, holding his stomach. "Excuse me, I don't feel well." Lucas quickly stood beside him. "Let me help. Come on, George, we'll get you to the bathroom." The two men exited toward the staircase. The other guests resumed murmured conversation, but Miss Marple sat quietly, her tea untouched. Something was off. That much she was sure of. The tale of the poisoned husband might have been exaggerated or not. But George's sudden illness, the nervous energy of the guests, the subtle glances between Abigail and John, it wasn't just awkward socializing. There was tension here, deep and knotted. And Miss Marple had learned long ago, where there is tension, there is something to uncover. She leaned back, eyes flickering once more, toward the darkened window George had spoken of. The glass was clean, but somehow the reflection seemed just a little too still. Ooh. Chapter 3. Shadows of Suspicion. The silence that had descended on the garden was suffocating. The two shots had shattered the calm evening air, and now, beneath the swaying branches and the watchful windows of the grand house, two lifeless bodies lay on the cold earth. Abigail, her pale silk dress now soaked with blood, and John, motionless beside her. Ethel stood a few feet away, frozen. In her right hand, trembling slightly, was a revolver. Guests, servants, and household staff poured into the garden, their footsteps hurried and voices murmuring in disbelief. Lucas was among the first to arrive, his face a contorted mix of confusion, shock, and fury. George, still looking unwell from his earlier illness, followed slowly behind, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon the scene. Lucas stormed toward Ethel, his voice rising. "Why did you kill Abigail and John?" Ethel turned to him sharply, her voice shaking but clear. "What nonsense are you talking about? I didn't kill them." Lucas pointed a finger directly at the revolver in her hand. "You're holding the gun, Ethel. You're standing here with two dead bodies. Who else could have done it?" "I found the gun here in the garden," Ethel said, her voice desperate now. "When I followed Abigail and John, I heard the shots. I ran forward and saw them lying there, already dead. The gun was just lying nearby." But Lucas shook his head. "That's a lie. You were jealous of her, jealous of what I had. This is exactly what I should have expected." Ethel looked as though she had been slapped. A footman had already rushed to call the police. Within minutes, the sound of a siren sliced through the evening, and two officers entered the garden, one of them holding a notepad, the other glancing between the bodies, and the trembling woman holding a weapon. The officer in charge stepped forward, eyeing Ethel coldly. "Put the gun down, miss." Without a word, Ethel complied, slowly kneeling and placing the weapon carefully on the stone path before stepping back. "We're going to have to take you in for questioning," the officer said. "You were found at the scene with the gun." "That doesn't mean she fired it," came a new voice, firm but calm. All eyes turned. Miss Marple had appeared at the garden entrance, her expression composed, her walking stick held lightly in one hand. Though small and unassuming, her presence drew immediate attention. The officer frowned. "And you are?" "Jane Marple," she said politely. "I'm a guest, and someone who has had some experience with unfortunate events such as these." The officer gave a short nod, but remained focused. "She had the gun in her hand. That's enough for us to take her in." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice still gentle, but firm. "And is that truly enough? In your experience as a lawman, has it never occurred to you that appearances can deceive?" "Ma'am, we don't make assumptions, we go by evidence." "Then let's talk about evidence," Miss Marple said. "The gun was found in Ethel's hand, but where are the powder burns, the recoil marks? Has anyone checked?" The officers exchanged a glance. The senior one finally said, "We'll confirm all that at the station." Miss Marple's eyes turned to the guests now gathering on the stone terrace. "But before you take her, may I suggest something? Two men stand here, one, George, who claims to be a detective, and the other, Leo, a retired police officer. Why not involve them in the preliminary assessment? If Ethel is truly guilty, I'll be the first to step aside, but if she's not, then arresting her prematurely could risk letting the real murderer go free." There was a moment of silence. George, who had been leaning against the stone wall, cleared his throat. "She has a point." The guests began murmuring again as the officers marked off the area. Abigail's body was covered with a sheet. John's was soon to follow. The once joyful party had become a house of silence, pierced only by the distant sound of the wind rustling the trees. Miss Marple remained seated by Ethel, her gaze occasionally lifting toward the upper window George had once mentioned. The same window where a ghostly figure was said to have appeared decades ago. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in secrets. And someone in that house was hiding one, maybe more than one. And Miss Marple intended to uncover every single one of them. Chapter 4. The Shattered Silence. The garden had fallen into an uneasy stillness. The shock of what had just occurred, the sudden, brutal deaths of Abigail and John, hung in the air like a dense fog. The guests who had once mingled with soft laughter and gentle music now stood in tense clusters beneath the shadow of the great house, whispering among themselves, exchanging anxious glances. Some couldn't look at the bodies still covered with white cloth, while others stared in a daze, unable to comprehend how the evening had transformed into a nightmare. Ethel sat on the stone bench near the fountain, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Though the police had released her, for now, she remained under quiet observation, a cloud of suspicion trailing her every movement. Miss Marple, seated beside her, was silent. It was George who finally broke the silence, clearing his throat with a dramatic flair as he stepped forward. "Well, if no one else is going to speak, I suppose I must," he began, adjusting his tie with an air of exaggerated importance. "Let's start with the facts. The bullet struck Abigail from the front, right here." He pointed vaguely toward his chest, over his heart. "And John was shot in the back. That suggests they were facing one another, speaking perhaps, when the killer came from behind and fired at John first." A few guests nodded, some murmured. George took their murmurs as affirmation and went on. "Now," he continued, "if we're to assume that Ethel isn't the killer, and I'm not saying she isn't, then maybe, just maybe, Abigail killed John and then turned the gun on herself." Leo, standing near the terrace with arms crossed, let out a low grunt of disagreement. "No, George," he said firmly. "That doesn't hold. If Abigail intended to kill herself after shooting John, she wouldn't have aimed for her chest. She would have gone straight for her head. That's how most suicides happen when a gun's involved. Quick, certain, instant." George looked momentarily flustered. Perhaps she panicked, or she wasn't thinking clearly. Leo shook his head. Panic would make her miss, but she didn't. That shot was precise, no hesitation in that. George, eager not to be undermined, tried a new angle. Then maybe it was John who did the shooting. Leo raised an eyebrow. John shot Abigail, then shot himself in the back? Do you even hear yourself, George? A small ripple of laughter moved through the guests, but it died quickly. George flushed slightly but stood his ground. Then we're left with the obvious answer, George said, turning to face Ethel now. She did it. Ethel. She was jealous, furious that Lucas chose Abigail over her. She came to this party, smiled, nodded politely, and waited for her moment. Then she found her chance and killed them both. All eyes turned to Ethel, who stood slowly, trembling with outrage. "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't even have the gun until I found it lying there, after the shots were already fired." George didn't waver. "Then explain why you were the only one there. Why no one else saw anyone else in the garden. Why you were holding the gun." Leo stepped in again. "George, if this was truly a crime driven by jealousy, wouldn't she have just killed Abigail? Why kill John too? What motive did she have for that?" George paused, then said, "Maybe she only intended to kill Abigail. Maybe John saw it happen and tried to stop her. Maybe she panicked and shot him too." Miss Marple, still seated and watching quietly, finally spoke. Her voice was calm but carried weight. "You're making a great many assumptions, Mr. George," she said. "Assumptions that fit your narrative, but not necessarily the facts. There are many ways to interpret what happened, especially when so many of us didn't see it ourselves." George turned to her, exasperated. "Then what do you suggest, that a ghost did it?" He laughed sarcastically, but the laughter caught in his throat as he looked up toward the house. Everyone followed his gaze. There, in the upper window, the very same window George had earlier spoken of when telling his gruesome tale about the house's past, a figure stood. A man, wearing a coat and a hat, perfectly still. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The glass of the window was streaked with condensation and blotched with time-worn smudges, so the figure's face was blurred, unrecognizable, but it was undeniably a person, or something that looked like one. The garden was suddenly silent again. George's face drained of color. "It's him," he whispered. "The ghost, the one I told you about. The man who died here. He's real." Miss Marple, on the other hand, rose calmly and adjusted her shawl. "Ghost or no ghost," she said, "this doesn't explain what happened tonight. Real people were shot, real lives were lost, and someone, living not spectral, is responsible." The officers broke from their trance and moved quickly to the bodies. After examining the scene once more, they ordered both Abigail and John to be taken for post-mortem examination. "Forensics will tell us more," one officer muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced that evidence alone would solve this case. As the bodies were wheeled away, the guests began to slowly retreat indoors, whispering anxiously about what they had just seen. Miss Marple stood with Leo, who looked unsettled. "What do you make of it?" he asked her quietly. "I think," she said, "that everyone here is a little too eager to believe what's easiest to accept. A ghost makes for a tidy explanation. It spares people from looking inward. But I'm more interested in the angle of the bullets and the emotions brewing under the surface. Jealousy, betrayal, fear. These are far more dangerous than any ghost." Leo gave a small nod. "Do you think Ethel did it?" Miss Marple looked toward Ethel, who now stood alone near the hedges, her face turned to the sky as if trying to will away the horror of the night. "No," she said, "but someone wants us to think she did." Then, quietly, she added, "And that someone is closer than we think." With the house now cast in shadow and the stars flickering uncertainly above, Miss Marple walked slowly back inside, her eyes once again drifting up to the mysterious window. The glass no longer held a figure, only the reflection of the garden below, and a darkness that seemed to watch back. Chapter 5. Doubts Cast in the Garden. The night air in the garden had grown colder, a biting wind weaving its way between the uneasy guests who lingered around the fountain and the blood-stained ground where 2 lives had ended. Whispers floated like ghosts among them, but it was Miss Marple's calm, clear voice that cut through the restless murmurs. "Mr. George," she began, her tone almost conversational, "how many cases have you actually solved in your career?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and sharp. George, who had been strutting about the garden a few moments earlier, swelling with self-importance, stiffened noticeably. The guests turned their attention toward him, sensing a confrontation brewing. George shifted on his feet and adjusted his collar. "Are you questioning my abilities?" he said, attempting a chuckle that fell flat against the taut atmosphere. Miss Marple remained seated on the bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She gave a gentle smile, but her eyes were steady as steel. "Indeed I am. It's a simple question after all. How many cases solved? What notable achievements? How many commendations or awards bestowed upon you by the government?" George's face reddened. His bravado faltered as he realized he was cornered. "Well, detective work isn't all medals and speeches, Miss Marple. Much of it is discreet." "Discreet," Miss Marple repeated, almost thoughtfully. "A convenient word that. It covers a multitude of inadequacies." A ripple of suppressed amusement moved through the guests, but George's expression darkened. Before he could mount a defense, Miss Marple continued, her voice still mild but cutting. "I rather think you haven't truly solved a case in your life, Mr. George. And those unfortunate souls you may have helped convict." She paused delicately. "I fear many of them might have been innocent." There was a heavy silence. No one dared to break it. George opened his mouth, but no words came out. He turned helplessly toward Leo as if seeking an ally, but Miss Marple's gaze had already moved to the retired policeman. "And you, Mr. Leo?" she said smoothly. "I'm afraid your record is not much brighter. I happen to know that your early retirement from Scotland Yard was not entirely your own choice. It was encouraged, was it not? Because your superiors doubted your judgment and your investigative methods." Leo's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes confirmed the truth of Miss Marple's words. Some of the guests exchanged uneasy glances. The authority of both men, already fragile, was crumbling rapidly. Miss Marple allowed a moment's pause before speaking again, her voice softening as she turned to Ethel, who was still standing stiffly by the hedges, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "I have known Ethel since she was a little girl," Miss Marple said to the crowd. "She is not a violent person, and what's more, her aim, if I may be blunt, is dreadful. I have seen her fail to hit a simple target even at a summer fete. There is simply no way she could have fired 2 precise shots, one into a man's back and the other straight into a woman's heart." There was a murmur of agreement from a few of the villagers who had known Ethel from earlier years. But George, desperate to regain his footing, barked, "A person can do anything when they're jealous. Rage drives people to extraordinary acts. You, Miss Marple, of all people, should know that." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "Indeed, jealousy can drive people to violence, but rage is often wild, uncontrolled. It leads to messy, frantic crimes, not clean, well-placed shots like these, and certainly not in the heart and the back, from such distances, in the dark. George looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came. His bluster had failed him. The certainty he had wielded so arrogantly was slipping from his grasp. Miss Marple rose slowly from the bench, her frail figure somehow commanding the attention of the entire garden. "This tragedy we have witnessed tonight," she said, addressing everyone now, "will not be solved by rushing to the easiest conclusion. It will not be solved by assuming the worst of those who appear vulnerable. It will be solved by patience, by clear thinking, and by looking at the facts, not the fears." She turned once more to the police officers who stood watching, their expressions thoughtful. "I suggest," Miss Marple said, "that before anyone is formally accused, a full and proper investigation be conducted. Examine the gun, examine the angle of the bullets, examine the window." She glanced upward toward the shadowy window where the blurred figure had been seen earlier. Tonight it stood empty again, but the memory of it lingered. Miss Marple's gaze swept the gathering one last time before she added, "There is more to this house than meets the eye, and more to this crime than simple jealousy." With that, she gently took Ethel by the arm and led her back toward the house, leaving behind a garden full of shaken, uncertain faces, and two men, George and Leo, stripped of the authority they had tried so hard to project. As the wind stirred the trees and the last guests reluctantly drifted inside, one thing was clear. The truth, buried beneath layers of old grudges and whispered lies, was still waiting to be unearthed. And Miss Marple intended to dig it out, piece by piece. Chapter 6. Secrets Behind Closed Doors. The night had settled heavily around the house, but Miss Marple showed no signs of weariness. While most of the guests were either too shaken or too fearful to remain outside, she stood calmly in the moonlit garden, her sharp mind weaving together the evening's troubling threads. Lucas, who had spent much of the evening fluctuating between anger and discomfort, was leaning against a stone balustrade near the terrace. He seemed uneasy as Miss Marple approached him, but he straightened slightly, attempting a casual posture. "Mr. Lucas," Miss Marple said, her voice as polite and measured as ever, "may I ask you a few questions?" Lucas nodded warily. "Of course." She wasted no time. "Why did you break off your engagement with Ethel?" Lucas shifted, looking away toward the shadowed garden before answering. "Because I wanted to marry Abigail," he said bluntly. "I realized Ethel wasn't the one for me. I met Abigail and everything changed." There was no trace of guilt or regret in his voice, only a matter-of-fact coldness that Miss Marple noted carefully. "I see," she said. "And how exactly did your relationship with Abigail begin?" Lucas hesitated briefly, then said, "I met her at a restaurant by chance. She was there with a few friends. We got to talking. After that, we started meeting more often, and eventually, well, I asked her to marry me. She said yes, but there was one condition. She wanted us to visit Germany together before the wedding." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Germany? That's rather specific." Lucas shrugged. "She said she had always wanted to see it, a sort of adventure before settling down." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on the stone railing, her mind working swiftly. "And how did John come into your life?" she asked. "In Germany," Lucas replied. "We met John there. He was traveling alone. We stayed at the same inn, got to talking one evening over dinner, and became friends. It was easy, natural. John was, well, he was helpful, a good man to have around." Miss Marple allowed a moment's pause before continuing. "And how long has John been staying here with you?" "A week," Lucas said. "He arrived last Saturday." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. Thank you, Mr. Lucas. That clears up quite a few things. Lucas frowned. Does it? In a way, Miss Marple said with a faint smile. But now, if you don't mind, I'd like to have a look around the house. Lucas looked reluctant. Is that really necessary? Miss Marple's smile remained steady. I think you'll find it is, especially if you wish to see this matter resolved. Reluctantly, Lucas agreed, and Miss Marple, taking a small torch from her handbag, made her way inside. The grand house, though elegant, felt strangely hollow as she walked its corridors. Paintings hung at awkward angles, the carpets were luxurious but worn in certain spots, and the air carried a faint, musty scent, as though the house had not truly been lived in, but merely displayed. She climbed the staircase slowly, her steps making no more sound than a whisper. She passed bedrooms, guest rooms, and studies, peeking in briefly but noting nothing unusual, until she reached the end of the corridor. There, directly opposite the garden, was the window everyone had spoken about, the window where the ghost had been seen, the so-called ghost room. Miss Marple paused outside the door. It was slightly ajar. A faint chill seemed to seep out into the hallway. She pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The room was sparsely furnished, an old writing desk against one wall, a heavy wooden wardrobe in the corner, and a large, ornate mirror above a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled and slightly dusty, as if no one had slept there properly in weeks. But it was the window that drew Miss Marple's attention. She approached it carefully. The glass was smeared, fogged with grime and age, just as described. It was easy to see how a blurred figure could be imagined there, especially if the mind was already primed with stories of ghosts and old tragedies. Yet, as Miss Marple examined the window frame, she noticed something peculiar. Faint scuff marks on the inner ledge, as though someone had recently stood there, or perhaps leaned heavily against it. She turned her torch to the wardrobe. Opening it revealed dusty old coats and hats. One, she noted, very much like the figure seen earlier, a dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't a ghost that had appeared at the window tonight. It was someone trying very deliberately to create the illusion of one. She turned back to the fireplace. On the edge of the hearthstone, half hidden in the dust, was a fresh footprint. Small, likely a woman's, but heavy enough to suggest haste or panic. Miss Marple's mind raced. Someone had been here recently, perhaps even during the time of the murders. Chapter 7. The Hidden Marksman. The moon hung high above the estate, casting silver light over the darkened hedges and the solemn gathering in the garden. Miss Marple stood near the stone path, calm as ever, while a group of uneasy guests and a few uniformed officers formed a loose semicircle around her. The air was heavy with anticipation. The murders of Abigail and John had cast a long, chilling shadow, but now Miss Marple was ready to lift the veil. "Thank you for gathering," she began, her voice carrying across the stillness. "There's something you all need to know. Ethel is not the murderer." There was a stir among the guests. George, who stood a little to the side with Leo and Lucas, crossed his arms tightly. Lucas shifted uncomfortably but kept his expression neutral. Miss Marple continued, "In fact, the true murderer is connected to that ghostly window upstairs." A ripple of confusion spread. "How can a window be a murderer?" someone muttered. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Of course I don't mean the window itself, but what appeared behind it. The so-called ghost. That was no spirit. It was a trick, a carefully staged illusion." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the tall window above them. None of you may have realized this, but the window can be opened. And what you all thought was a man wearing a coat and hat was nothing more than a stand, a coat rack, to be precise, with a long overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat draped over it. The glass of the window is old and foggy, its surface stained and smudged. Seen from the garden with the right lighting, it created the perfect illusion of a ghostly figure watching us. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. George, trying to recover his footing, scoffed. "So what? Are you saying the stand is the murderer?" Miss Marple turned to face him directly. "No, Mr. George, the murderer is Lucas." A collective gasp followed her words. All eyes shifted to Lucas, who tensed, but said nothing. George's face turned red. "How dare you accuse my friend? Lucas is a respected man. Miss Marple raised a hand gently, silencing him. "George, may I ask you something? At the start of the party, didn't Lucas take you out into the garden? Didn't he tell you the story about the ghost in the window? Didn't he point to it and show you the eerie figure standing there?" George blinked, his indignation fading into confusion. Yes, that's exactly what happened." Miss Marple gave a small, confirming nod. "He was planting the story in your mind, so you'd remember seeing the ghostly figure before the crime even occurred. It was all part of his plan." She turned back to the group. "Now think. After dinner, Abigail and John went out to the garden. Ethel, who had been anxious to confront Abigail, followed them. Around the same time, George began feeling unwell, and Lucas, acting the gracious host, took him upstairs to the bathroom to help him vomit. That bathroom, if you recall, is attached to Lucas's own bedroom. She let that sink in before continuing. While George was vomiting, Lucas slipped into the adjacent ghost room, opened the window, and with a hunter's precision, shot both Abigail and John. Afterward, he threw the gun down into the garden, right where Ethel found it. He returned to George and rejoined the others, playing the innocent. Gasps turned to stunned silence. Lucas's face, once carefully composed, now showed the first hints of panic. "Lucas is a skilled marksman," Miss Marple went on. "He's hunted for years. His accuracy is well known. Only someone with that level of skill could have made those precise shots. One to the chest, another to the back, in the dark, from that height." Leo, who had been listening intently, gave a slow nod. "The angle of the bullets, it matches what we saw. That shot could very well have come from the upstairs window." Miss Marple turned to the police officers. "Would you be so kind as to go upstairs and open that window for everyone to see?" 2 constables immediately obeyed. They disappeared into the house, and moments later, the window creaked open above them. Everyone craned their necks. As the officers stepped aside, the group below could now clearly see the inside of the room. There, standing just behind the window pane, was the infamous figure, a hat and coat carefully arranged on a wooden stand, positioned so perfectly that it had fooled them all. A wave of realization rippled through the garden. Miss Marple addressed the group again. "Lucas deliberately staged the ghost to mislead us. He knew that if we were all focused on a decades-old legend, it would distract us from what really happened. He wove the story into the evening from the very beginning, taking George aside, planting the ghost tale, and setting up the sighting. He turned a murder into a haunting, hoping we'd follow the myth instead of the facts." Lucas finally snapped. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof, just guesses and stories." Miss Marple turned her cool gaze on him. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain how the stand appeared behind that window, or how the gun ended up in the garden with no prints, or why your story about meeting Abigail and John in Germany doesn't match the timeline of your engagement to Ethel. Shall I go on?" Chapter 8. Truth in the Shadows. A deep, unsettling silence had settled over the garden after Miss Marple's revelation. The mystery that had cloaked the evening in dread was now unraveling rapidly, thread by thread. All eyes were fixed on Lucas. He stood still, his face drained of all color, his mouth slightly open as if the words Miss Marple had spoken were still echoing inside his head. There was no more room for denial. One of the officers stepped closer. "Mr. Lucas, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Lucas looked around, the guests, the police, George's shocked face, Leo's steely gaze, and finally, Ethel's tear-streaked eyes. And then, slowly, he exhaled. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I did it. I killed them both, Abigail and John." A gasp swept through the crowd, but no one interrupted. Lucas straightened his shoulders, and though his voice was even, there was a tremble just beneath the surface. "When we went to Germany, at Abigail's request, I had no idea what was truly going on. We met John there, at a cafe. He seemed friendly, open, helpful. It was John who initiated the friendship. I thought it was harmless, a casual bond while traveling, but I was wrong." He paused for a moment, swallowed hard, then continued. "Abigail was different after Germany, distant, secretive. At first, I thought she was just nervous about the wedding, but when I invited John to stay with us before the party, I noticed things, looks exchanged between them, whispers. And then, that night..." Lucas glanced up at the dark window above them, where the illusion of the ghost had once stood. "One night I saw Abigail leave our bedroom and slip quietly into John's room. I followed her. Not to confront her, but because I needed to know. I listened at the door, and what I heard destroyed me." He took a shaky breath. "They were planning to kill me, not just leave me or betray me. They wanted me dead. They said once I was gone, they'd take the house, the money, everything. They wanted it all." The crowd was deathly still. Even George, once his defender, said nothing now. Lucas went on, bitterness leaking into his voice. "That night I decided I wouldn't be the one lying in the ground. If they were going to plot against me, I would strike first. And I'd do it in a way that no one would ever suspect." He looked over at Ethel, who stood frozen near Miss Marple. "I wrote to Ethel, invited her here deliberately. I needed someone to frame, someone whose presence would explain the crime, someone the police would suspect." Ethel's lips parted in disbelief. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "I thought, if I did it carefully enough, I could kill them, plant the gun in the garden, and let the ghost story take care of the rest. I even told George the legend myself, showed him the figure in the window, just to ensure the story stuck in his head. So when the shots were fired, and people saw Ethel standing over the bodies, the story would come together on its own." The room seemed to tilt with the weight of his confession. Miss Marple stepped forward now, her voice soft, yet firm. "You planned everything. The friendship with John, the timing of the invitation, the manipulation of the ghost story, all to cover a premeditated double murder." Lucas didn't deny it. One of the officers stepped forward. "That's enough. Mr. Lucas, you're under arrest for the murders of Abigail and John. You have the right to remain silent." As the officer read Lucas his rights, handcuffs were placed around his wrists. Lucas didn't struggle. His face held the strange calm of a man who had finally dropped the burden of deception. George looked devastated. Leo turned away. As Lucas was led out of the garden toward the waiting patrol car, Ethel stood still, her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing herself against the cold and the grief of it all. Miss Marple walked gently over to her. "I told you not to come to this party," she said softly. "And you should have listened, my dear. When someone older tells you to stay away from something, it's usually for a good reason." At that, Ethel broke down. All the fear, the stress, the guilt, and the helplessness she had carried for days poured out in trembling sobs. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Miss Marple, clinging to her like a child. "If you hadn't been with me," Ethel cried, "I don't know what would have happened to me. I would have gone to jail for something I didn't do." "Everyone believed I was the one." Miss Marple held her tightly. "You were brave to come, and even braver to trust the truth. That's what saved you." As the police cars drove off and the guests slowly began to drift away, shaken but relieved, Ethel and Miss Marple remained in the garden, surrounded by the quiet hum of the night. The shadow of the ghost in the window was gone, replaced now by the light of truth and the knowledge that justice had been served. For now, the house was at peace. And so was Ethel.